So, hi everyone. My name is Kim. I'm from Oxford PharmaGenesis, as Yuri stated. We're a health science communications company. We work with approximately 100 pharmaceutical companies and biotechs, and 9 of the top 10 big pharma companies. My academic background is molecular neuroscience and genetics, so I'm not a computer scientist by any stretch. Key tools for my trade were bioinformatics tools. So what bioinformatics essentially is using computers to help solve biological problems. So that's where I came from. I'm now scientific director at Oxford PharmaGenesis, and I've got a team that uses semantic technologies, so knowledge graphs, NLP, so natural language processing, and large language models, to help with evidence synthesis and knowledge discovery from unstructured documents, largely, so text. So I still work with bioinformatics, I would say, but instead of handling massive sequences of DNA, I'm handling sequences of letters now. So again, text. Bit of a delay. Okay, so our feeling is that the next generation of medicine will be built on AI. And that's likely to be generative AI. But clearly the substrate for AI has to be data. And we see that that's a current flaw. There's a problem with the data. So to achieve the future that we want, we've got to fix the foundations. We've got to fix the data in the first place. So at the moment, what seems to be occurring is there's data all over the place. We've got data coming out of our ears, and it gets kind of dumped in a big pile, in a big repository. So we might have genetic data, molecular data, more publications than you can possibly handle. Just one repository called PubMed has some 40 million publications. So there's knowledge trapped in those publications. How do we get it out? At the moment, people tend to be thinking about these buckets, these data lakes, and just, well, we'll throw AI at it, and we'll see what comes out. That will solve things, right? But probably not. What we think probably the solution will be is to create an infrastructure whereby we have foundational knowledge, where we have data with relationships to other data, where we have context, and where we have provenance. So if we think about some of the additional problems, in terms of medical information, there are many, many different stakeholders. These are just 4 examples. So doctors, patients, scientists, various functions within pharmaceutical companies like medical affairs, all of these people have medical questions, but they all come at it from a different perspective, and they likely want the output in a different format as well. So our idea is that we have this common infrastructure that will be able to provide different stakeholders with answers to their questions, but incorporate agents that will be able to develop more information, more outputs in a format that they might require. So a patient, for example, is going to want very different answers to a doctor might. So maybe they want a lay summary version of an answer to their question. Maybe they even want an infographic version of an answer to their question. So in terms of the pharmaceutical industry, one of the issues is that there are lots of different sources of data. So for example, some pharma companies have their own clinical trial platforms. There are government clinical trial platforms, so clinicaltrials.gov is probably the most well-known. Publications I mentioned, there are millions and millions of publications. There are platforms which deliver patient lay summary publications. There are enhanced content platforms. These are things like videos and podcasts and infographics. There are package inserts that pharmaceutical companies develop. They're the bits of paper that you get in your packet of drugs with loads of clinical trial output information and safety information in. And then there's a whole bunch of databases. So what do I do if I have a medical question? So my example question, how does remternetug's effectiveness compare with donanemab? So traditionally, up until the last couple of years, you would type that into some search engine, probably Google, or maybe just keywords, and you'd be presented with a list of URLs, such as this. But then I have to go through a whole bunch of steps. I have to click on each of these URLs. I have to read the information. I have to determine the quality of the information presented. I have to think about the source, so should I trust this source? Because why did the search engine surface these in the first place? I don't have a clue of the provenance of these data. More recently, when you do a search, of course, we've all seen this, you now get a synthesis of the content of these URLs that's been provided by a large language model. But again, do I trust that synthesis? Again, where did it come from? I have no idea. Chatbots, these are of course everywhere. Perplexity is just an example of one of the many. So now I can enter my research question and I get presented with an answer and some sources that provided that answer. But I have the same problem around these sources. Why were these sources prioritized? Are they trusted sources? Where did those data come from? So if we have a quick look at this answer. Remternetug is more effective than donanemab at clearing amyloid plaques. Okay, sounds good, but should I believe that? Well, I don't know anything about the clinical trial that provided those data. What phase was the trial that they're referring to in this answer? And really importantly, well, what were the patient populations in the trials where this answer came from? Because if they're different populations, this answer is useless to me. So there's a problem there. Academics are increasingly using semantic searches also, so platforms like OpenEvidence and Elicit. So I type my question into these tools to see what we get. So OpenEvidence, well, for starters, my drug's not recognized in the medical literature. Well, that's a bit of a problem because it's in the medical literature. So then the LLM decided that I was probably talking about lecanemab and provided me a response based on that drug. Well, that's a bit concerning. Elicit did slightly better. It still couldn't find evidence, so it didn't make up a load of stuff I didn't want. It kind of flagged that it got problems, but why couldn't it find the evidence that I was after? Similar tools are being developed for clinicians. Similar problems apply. Tools aimed at patients. Similar problems apply. The whole problem is, where is the data coming from? Some of these tools couldn't find data, as I illustrated. Well, that's because sometimes the data is sparse. So people have touched upon hallucinations in other talks. So where data are sparse, we risk hallucinations. So that's when the LLM might well make things up. We can't have that in the medical domain. So one of the ways you can do a semantic search is retrieval augmented generation, a type of retrieval augmented generation. So what happens here is I have a query, and my query is going to be matched to source documents. So that could be, for example, every abstract in PubMed. So for every abstract in PubMed, these would be chunked down into smaller chunks of text, and embeddings would be created. So these are numerical representations of that text. The same thing would happen to my query, and then a similarity search would be occurred. So how close are these numerical vectors, these embeddings, to each other? And then that subset of where my question and my document chunks are closely together, these would then be the source documents for the LLM to generate its answer. But there are problems with that. So a vector embedding, that numerical representation of text, is a lossy compression of the source. So I've got my paper here, and it's all gone a bit fuzzy, because when I turn it into this big vector, information is lost. What AI is not doing, it's not doing an OCR, an optical character recognition of this paper, and then storing absolutely everything. It's not a database. It's not a knowledge store. So that's a big challenge that we've got to overcome. Most users of AI at this point do think they're dealing with a database that is going to pull facts out accurately, And that's not necessarily the case, as we know. Move on for the interest of time. To keep things simple, there are other problems which are a massive problem in terms of medicine, in that sometimes concepts are referred to using different terms. So it's exactly the same entity, exactly the same concept, but it's got different terms. So one paper might refer to remternetug, one LY blah, 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 and another just call it a next-generation monoclonal antibody. So that means the vector representations that LLMs will generate are going to be spread apart, more distant, even though this is exactly the same compound. So that's a problem. So semantic search is going to struggle. So quick summary of the challenges. We cannot have hallucinations in the medical domain. Lives are really at risk. And we don't know where data is coming from. AI systems have their inherent biases. Some of those are inherited from humans in the way that clinical trials might have been conducted, but some of them are in the training data. Model degradation we've touched upon, actually, as the day goes on as well. It's really concerning now that lots of content, and that includes medical content, is actually generated by AI now. But given that we don't know where it came from in the first place, how the hell can we trust that stuff? So we've got to think about solutions. So a more intelligent way to search through that information, verifiable answers, source document authentication. So where did a document come from? Who owns it? When did they put it there? So this leads to a potential solution. So a biomedical knowledge stack. So we need an immutable audit trail. So again, who provided these data? So was it Pfizer? Was it Roche? Was it Novartis? And what clinical trial was it? And when did it happen? And if the data changed, when did those data change? The data need to be truly machine readable, so not just numerical representations of the information, but structured data. So actually knowledge, not just data. And then interoperable standards, which again is actually a massive problem in medicine. So this is where we're thinking about ontologies, so that different data sources and different data types can kind of talk to each other. Move on again. So the OriginTrail graph that we're building, and I'll show that shortly. So RDF can semantically enrich our data by mapping to ontologies. So ontologies are foundational knowledge. So this means we can get around problems like entities having loads of different names and not being used universally. So here, for example, we have our drug, and it's got another label. So this is now a fact that's encoded in our database. Our drug has a target, and we know exactly what that target is. So our data is now factual. It's kind of atoms of knowledge stored in our database, and it's this database that we can then use LLMs to interact with, rather than their fuzzy, compressed representations of the internet often. So rather than just doing vector-based similarity searches, semantic searches, we can now do RDF-based searches using the Sparkle query language. So we can now be a lot clearer about what we actually want from those data. So find specific entities. Find studies that compare both those entities, those drugs, and then pull out particular data that I'm interested in. So the final solution, the DKG. So we have a blockchain layer. This means we know who owns the data, who put the data in the knowledge graph, when did they do so, if it changed, when did it change. We have a knowledge graph that now just doesn't contain data, it actually contains knowledge in those RDF triples. So any publication, for example, data will be extracted and converted into RDF triples. So these atomic facts, not just vectors. And then we have a neural AI layer, which can do two things. One, it can help us convert things like publications into RDF triples, into facts. But it's also useful for a user because they can now interact with the knowledge graph, with those data using natural language questions. So this is an example of neurosymbolic AI. So using neural AI, so large language models in this case, and then the knowledge graph is that middle layer there. So how do you use it? Ultimately, the idea is it's very simple. You still ask your question, but now you retrieve answers from the knowledge graph. Then the LLM will work with those data, the facts, to return an answer. So where we are, so we're in the early stages. We've partnered with UCB Pharma. So they like the vision, so it's amazing that they've come on board. We're starting small because there will be problems along the way. So to help solve those problems, we need to start small. So we're just focusing on 4 UCB products in the neurology space. And we're starting to ingest those data into the knowledge graph. So lots of different data types. So we've got publications of clinical trials. We've got patient lay summaries of clinical trials. We've got these package inserts. Again, these things that go into the packets of drug, because there's a wealth of data produced by the pharmaceutical company in those. And then clinical trials registered by pharmaceutical companies go on clinicaltrials.gov and other databases. So we pull down those records. So in JSON format, so a highly structured format, and then we can use the data from all these different sources, convert it into these RDF triples, into these facts, and those then become the source data. Not quite that easy, as we'll see. There are obviously going to be challenges. To map the data coming from clinical trial records, we've developed a custom ontology. For bibliographic data, we're using an ontology called Fabio. For medical terminology, we're starting with SNOMED. There are others. And for drug-specific information, one called RxNorm. And here, we have a very quick demo of where we're up to. So a user uploads a file. They ask the DKG to process that file. We then have our PDF. We have the information extracted from that PDF. We can check and edit. We then generate triples based on the ontologies that we've also provided to the DKG. We can check those statements, change them if we need to. Everything's uploaded properly. So we can see what the graph of those triples look like based on the sources we've provided. And then we can ask questions of that graph. So now when answers are returned, I can read the answers generated by the LLM based on the facts in the knowledge graph and see exactly where it came from and what the provenance of those data were. So hopefully this is a step in the right direction at handling medical misinformation. It's a start.